Welcome, I'm Curtis Myers. My interest in the history of local aviation began nearly 15 years ago with a small Fairchild airplane model. Little did I realize at the time that the research of this object would effectively change my life. The story I found, just resting under the surface, was one that inspired me, a story of an unbroken lineage of airplane manufacturing that spanned nearly 70 years. But more importantly, there was a story of a community and its people that had been profoundly molded and changed by the building of airplanes. Hagerstown is truly a community blessed by its past. It is into this past that we shall now go, on a journey of rediscovery, a journey to remember our aviation heritage. The first manned airplane flight by the Wright brothers in 1903 began the greatest movement of human transportation in history. No longer was man confined to his grounded domain, but through proper formation, earthly compounds such as wood, metal, and cloth could be combined and transformed into a machine capable of lifting him to the clouds and beyond. Scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and everyday tinkerers took up the task of making human flight safe and relevant. The scramble for the greatest, fastest, and farthest flying airplane had begun, a scramble that continues to this day. Giuseppe Bellanca was one of these early pioneers. From Italy, he had immigrated to the United States in 1911 and founded a pilot training school. In 1916, he was offered a job by the Maryland Press Steel Company of Hagerstown, Maryland, to design and build this company's first airplane. Given the title of consulting engineer of the aircraft division in early 1916, Bellanca took up residence in a one-room apartment owned by Judge John Hewitt on West Washington Street. During World War I, Maryland Press Steel Company was a major supplier of guns, mines, and ammunition to the Allied powers of Great Britain and France, and was anxious to break into the fast-growing aviation industry. The Maryland Press Steel Factory still stands here on Pope Avenue on the south side of Hagerstown. The former Pope Bicycle and Automobile Factory was taken over in 1915 by the Maryland Press Steel Company. It was here that the first Bellanca airplane was completed in September of 1916, giving this building the unique distinction of being Hagerstown's very first airplane factory. The first plane was fitted with a 35 horsepower, 3-cylinder Anzani aircraft engine, and had a wingspan of 26 feet and weighed 400 pounds. Given the designation of CD, it was rolled out to Dobbs Meadow, just south of downtown Hagerstown, and today the site of the South Hagerstown High School, where it was piloted by Bellanca on its maiden flight. The first flight was successful, with the airplane achieving a top speed of 70 miles per hour. The Bellanca CD, however, had been designed and produced with some haste, and never went into production. Both its designer and financial backer desired something greater. Before the CD's completion, work had begun on the Model CE. This airplane was a near complete departure from its predecessor, and was fully designed over the next 2 years. Completed in early 1919, it sported improvements in horsepower and flight control, and differed considerably in overall appearance. Fitted with an improved 6-cylinder 45 horsepower Anzani engine capable of 102 miles per hour, it took to the air and was able to climb an unheard of 780 feet in the first minute. Flown by Hagerstown native and former Army Aviation Corps test pilot Paul Stonebreaker, the CE wasted no time in showing its makers that it was a truly revolutionary airplane. It reacted so well that when Stonebreaker pushed the throttle to full, the airplane easily broke its estimated top speed of 102 miles per hour. With initial testing of the airplane done, the CE was flown to several air shows and meets to get the opinion of potential purchasers. An aggressive advertising campaign was launched to increase public awareness of the company's new product, with ads being placed in nationally distributed magazines and in regional newspapers. The advertising showed a flair not typical of the day. They had an overriding theme of the fanciful, with catchy slogans like "The tail's end tells the tale," "The machine you will eventually fly," and "Built like a gun and as graceful as a gull." The first sale of the Bellanca CE came in early 1919. But the end of World War I, a few months earlier, had meant the cancellation of military contracts for Maryland Press Steel. 2 Bellanca airplanes had been fully produced here, but by the end of 1920, less than 2 years later, the company was bankrupt. However, Giuseppe Bellanca's career was not to end here. His time in Hagerstown was to be the decisive starting line to a brilliant and inventive career. The monumental role that he would play in the progress of aviation had yet to be written, but it would be written elsewhere. It was in 1921 that Lou Reisner, a former employee of Giuseppe Bellanca at Maryland Press Steel, founded the Reisner Aero Service. The company had been formed to do general repair work on aircraft, as well as rebuild and sell World War I surplus airplanes. Reisner also had a desire to expand into selling new airplanes, and for several years attempted to become the regional distributor for the Waco Aircraft Company. Lacking the financial capital necessary, he partnered with local shoe manufacturer Kreider in 1925 to form Kreider-Reisner Aircraft Company. Kreider's family owned the Hagerstown Shoe and Legging Company and several other shoe factories in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Originally from Annville, Pennsylvania, just outside of Lebanon, Kreider became the president of the new company. While working in the family business, he had continued on in the production of shoes, but was a man caught up in the thrill of aviation, and was continuously corresponding with aircraft manufacturers, even before he had acquired his license in 1923.
August 9th, 1923. Attention A. McNamee. Your letter of the 7th is acknowledged and would like to know whether you have any OX5 Orioles for sale and the price on same. Would you consider a shipment without the motor, as the writer has some new OX5 motors?
August 7, 1923. To Mr. A. H. Kreider. Dear Sir, replying to your request of July 14, please be advised that the OX5 motor can be installed in the K6 Oriole by the addition of 6 metal clasps.
First-class condition. Can you let me know what speed the motor turns over at for 60 miles per hour, and also for 85 miles per hour? Would also like to know the amount of open space needed for takeoff and landing compared with the JN4D. Yours truly, Amon Kreider.
Joining with Lou Reisner, the two had a mutual desire to make a mark in the aviation industry. Kreider's contribution to the venture, beyond simply capital, was a flair as a public relations man. His love of flight was evident in his appearance and mirrored by his desire to be photographed in flying attire. Although Kreider was happiest when he was in the air, his skills went much farther than simply aviation. He was an astute and a successful businessman. Both Kreider and Reisner wasted little time in going after their dreams. Apart from securing the distribution of the Waco biplane, they began dabbling in the marketing of their own inventions. They began designing an airplane to enter into the 1926 National Air Races being held in Philadelphia. Reisner had some experience in designing aircraft, with his first being built in his basement while still in high school. But they also called on a friend, Frederick Seiler, to lend his expertise. What they devised was a small monoplane powered by a Wright-Morehouse engine, which they appropriately called the KR Midget. The smallest among the contenders, only 15 feet long, it flew to victory with an average speed of 94.5 miles per hour. It won the Scientific American Trophy race outright, and the KR Midget went on to perform in 2 other races, winning one and coming in second in the other. There was, however, another Hagerstown-built airplane contending against the KR Midget. Charles Myers, a good friend of both Kreider and Reisner, used the KR facilities in Hagerstown to build his small racer, called the Myers Midget. This airplane was a biplane fitted with a Wright-Morehouse engine. Fortune did not shine on the Myers Midget, and it was damaged on takeoff and forced out of the race. The success of the KR Midget, however, created an opportunity for Kreider-Reisner to capitalize on the publicity which their win achieved. If they could design an airplane that could be sold to the masses at a reasonable price, there was no telling how successful they could be. Under the direction of Frederick Seiler, they designed a 2-place biplane with a war-surplus Curtiss OX5 engine. The C-1 Challenger, as it was dubbed, first flew in May of 1927 from the small airfield near the company's workshop. A few weeks later, the C-1 began its tour of the eastern United States, stopping at airfields and allowing pilots to fly the new machine and critique its performance and handling. The result of this tour gave birth to the production version C-2 Challenger, which emerged from its paper blueprint in July 1927. It was capable of 102 miles per hour, with a rate of climb of 548 feet per minute. Along with offering the sport plane enthusiast such great performance, it also was available at the very affordable price of $3,100. Acceptance of the Challenger biplane was quick, and production began in August of 1927 in a group of buildings here on the 800 block of Pennsylvania Avenue. There was a brick building that had formerly been used for the tinning of milk cans. Other buildings, including this one, were used by Kreider-Reisner for the fabric covering of wings and fuselages. That which served as the office had been formerly Wood's Garage, a distributor of automobiles. In this two-story brick building, the KR Challenger airplanes were designed, and the everyday marketing decisions were devised. By the end of 1927, 11 Challenger airplanes had been produced and sold. The demand had continued to increase due to aggressive advertising in national aviation publications and by successes at air races throughout the country.
October 3rd, 1928. Gentlemen, our field managers at Greensboro and Spartansburg are already lining up some prospects and are anxious to obtain some literature on your plane. I would appreciate it if you would send me a supply of literature, and we'll take care of placing it in the hands of our local men. Cordially, C.S. Childs, General Manager, Pitcairn Aviation Incorporated.
By 1928, production had increased to 111 planes, and each one were produced in the patchwork of buildings serving as the Kreider-Reisner factory. The company quickly realized that its runway was inadequate for quantity production, and a plot of land was purchased adjacent to Route 11 near the Pennsylvania line. A hangar was erected where the planes would be towed and wings attached. The airplanes would then be test flown and approved for sale. The company's ability to create airplanes on such scale did not go unnoticed by the industry, and Kreider-Reisner was heralded by many as having one of the most successfully run organizations. Its ability to create aircraft with such speed, but without losing quality, was no less than phenomenal, considering the factory setting in which they worked. Successive introductions of greater horsepowered aircraft continued throughout 1928, and Kreider-Reisner Challenger biplanes became one of the most popular private owner aircraft of the late 1920s. Throughout this time, the company had continued to tow airplanes north to the airstrip. But the Kreider-Reisner airstrip was beginning to evolve into a life of its own. The flying community of the late 1920s was a small one, and landing strips and refueling stations were scarce. Hagerstown offered a very early stop for flyers, as well as a place to look over KR's new line of airplanes.
In 1928, the company designed a 32,000 square foot building and began an aggressive campaign to raise money for its construction. Kreider, who owned more than half of the company's stock, had the most to lose or to gain. He tried every imaginable way to raise money for this much-needed expansion, including speaking at local clubs and organizations, and organizing local wealthy families to invest. Only modestly successful, he was unable to raise enough money to undergo construction.
Kreider began to converse with Sherman Fairchild in late 1928 concerning a possible merger. Fairchild and Kreider were well aware of each other's achievements and had great respect for one another. Fairchild was also in the airplane business and had been very successful with the design and building of commercial and cargo aircraft. He had first made his mark in the design of aerial cameras and had, by 1929, created one of the first aviation empires. Under the Fairchild umbrella was the original camera company, an aerial survey company, several passenger airlines, and most significantly, the Fairchild Aviation Corporation, which had in 1928 produced more aircraft than any other airplane manufacturer. Fairchild was now attempting to break into the private owner sport plane market with his own designs, but with little success. If Sherman could not break into the private aircraft market, he would buy his way in. In March 1929, Fairchild purchased a controlling interest in Kreider-Reisner. With the investment of capital from Fairchild, the plans for expansion at Kreider-Reisner were given a green light. Fairchild had acquired a controlling interest in the company, but wanted it run as a subsidiary and separately from his other holdings. Amon Kreider would remain as president, Lou Reisner as vice president, and Fred Seiler as vice president and chief engineer. The official announcement was made at the second All-American Aircraft Show in Detroit. Airplanes were flown to Detroit for the initial kickoff, including the newly introduced Kreider-Reisner C6. The prospects for Kreider-Reisner and for Hagerstown never appeared brighter. On April 13th, 4 days after the initial announcement, Amon Kreider took off from the Detroit Ford Airport for a short ride. Approximately a minute later, another plane took off and verged directly in the path of Kreider, killing both men. Kreider was flown home and buried in his hometown of Annville, Pennsylvania. The funeral held for him included a farewell salute by 3 Kreider-Reisner airplanes. John Squires, formerly an executive of Chrysler Motor Car Company, was hired by the Fairchild board as the new president of Kreider-Reisner. But just as the new president was getting comfortable in his position, the financial situation in the United States was rocked by the stock market crash of October 29, 1929. The anticipated increase from the new facility of 10 aircraft a week was never realized. The Kreider-Reisner company quickly went from a workforce of 300 down to 15 to 20, and finished airplanes sat outside awaiting purchasers, many of which no longer had money for food, let alone an airplane. The Great Depression wreaked havoc on almost every individual and company throughout the U.S., and Sherman Fairchild was not spared from this. In 1929, he had combined his companies with the Aviation Corporation, a stock holding company. He did so with the hope of it offering money for expansion. But by early 1931, he had effectively lost direct control of the greatest majority of his holdings. Sherman Fairchild decided it was time to pull out. He knew that to do so would be detrimental to both the companies he had founded as well as his personal wealth. But all indications pointed toward even greater business disparity in the future. Extracting what he could, while he could, seemed the best course of action. Lost was the Fairchild Aviation Corporation, Ranger Engine Division, Camera Corporation, and Aerial Survey Company. What he was left with was his controlling interest in Kreider-Reisner. Although counted as one of the holdings of the Aviation Corporation, Sherman had kept majority stock in KR, which in this instance allowed him a chance to start over. Within a year, the newly founded Fairchild Aircraft Company and its Kreider-Reisner Aircraft Division of Hagerstown introduced its first airplane. The Fairchild 22, an open-cockpit, high-wing monoplane, quickly gained a foothold as a high-quality, inexpensive sport plane.
Although times remained quite lean, Sherman Fairchild was able to purchase back the Ranger Engine Division in the early 1930s and slowly rebuild his empire. In time, control of most all of his former companies was regained. But the Center for Aircraft Manufacturing was never to be shifted back to New York, but was to remain in the community that had offered escape and rebirth, the community of Hagerstown.
The early years of the Depression had forced the near closure of the old Kreider-Reisner airstrip in North Hagerstown. It had fallen into disrepair when it was taken over by native son Richard Henson in 1931. Dick, as he liked to be called, convinced several of his friends to buy a stake in a Kreider-Reisner 31 biplane. He founded the Henson flying service the same year and built a small white and green building to house his center of operations. With the field reopened and Fairchild beginning to expand, Dick Henson was asked by Sherman Fairchild if he would have an interest in test flying the new F-22. Although Dick later claimed he had absolutely no idea what the job entailed, there was no way he was going to pass on such an amazing opportunity. Although the Depression of the early 1930s offered little growth, Fairchild continued to build and improve upon the F-22. In 1933, the new closed-cabin F-24 was introduced and was quickly heralded as the Cadillac of small private airplanes. It offered leather upholstery, carpet, and a burled wood dash, as well as other opulent amenities which distinguished Fairchild as the leader in the upper-scale private plane marketplace.
In the mid-1930s, the company seemed content on winning back its innovative reputation, and indeed it was a time of experimentation in several revolutionary designs. They were asked by the Army in 1933 to develop a large single-engine airplane specifically for cargo hauling. Alfred Gassner, chief engineer at Fairchild, designed a cloth-covered airplane with a high wing. The C-31, as it became known, was a revolutionary design from the aspect of its cargo hauling capability. It could be easily loaded by backing a truck up to the large side doors, and had a spacious flat bed in the interior, which allowed for efficient packing of cargo from front to back. The Model C-31 cargo transport was first flown in September of 1934. Although it was formally evaluated by the military over the next year, only the prototype was ever made. The Model 45 came out in 1935 and was quickly dubbed the sedan of the air. It was a 5-place, low-wing monoplane which lived up to Fairchild's opulence throughout. Equally important during the mid-1930s was the contract to design and build for Pan American Airways, a single-engine, all-metal amphibian aircraft to be used in the Amazon regions of South America. Pan Am had originally given an order for 6 of the aircraft, but ended up only purchasing 2. The others were sold to corporations and individuals. One of the airplanes, designated the Kono, saw service with explorer Richard Archibald in the uncharted regions of New Guinea. Another was sold to famous boat designer and philanthropist Gar Wood. Yet another extraordinary airplane of the mid-1930s was the Fairchild Duramold 46. This airplane was one of the most revolutionary aircraft of the day and served as a test bed for the process devised by Fairchild engineer Virginius Clark. This airplane was actually made of molded plywood and plastic. It was molded into 2 halves, with each being placed in a specially constructed oven and at very high temperatures bonded together to make a composite of wood and plastic. Patented by the company, the rights for large aircraft were eventually sold to Howard Hughes for the building of the Spruce Goose.
Fairchild Aircraft's status in the community of Hagerstown in the late 1930s was one of technological advancement and progress. Even though they were not yet the largest employer in town, their impact was being felt through the diversity of people being drawn here to work, broadening and changing the very fabric and face of the community.
Dick Henson's flying service was experiencing considerable growth, and a large brick hangar was erected in 1938. Henson found himself managing the daily operations of an expanding airport and flying service, as well as working full-time as test pilot for Fairchild. By the late 1930s, sales of F-22s and 24s began to slowly creep upward, but it became obvious to Fairchild management that the true money in aviation lay in military contracts. In 1938, Fairchild Engineering, under the direction of Armin Theiblot, began to design an aircraft for military training purposes. Realizing that the existing frontline fighter aircraft were monoplanes, and that all training planes at that time were biplanes, it was believed that an opportunity existed to convert the entire fleet of trainers. Theiblot began to develop a low-wing monoplane with a cloth-covered steel frame. The plane had 2 seats with a metal-structured plate glass windshield for both student and instructor, and housed the Fairchild designed and built Ranger Inline 6 engine. In the summer of 1939, 2 Fairchild M62 trainers were entered in a competition at Wright Field, the U.S. Army Air Corps testing facility in Dayton, Ohio. Chief Fairchild test pilot Dick Henson took the plane through its paces and came away with a contract for 270 M62s. Dick had proved the worth of this little plane and both the Army and Navy were convinced of its merits. Throughout 1940 and 41, orders for the M62, which had been newly designated the PT-19, continued to flow in from the U.S. military, as well as Allied militaries already at war. Civilian training organizations inside and out of the U.S. were placing orders for this much-needed aircraft training tool. As increased factory space was being planned, the U.S. was attacked at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, and almost overnight, the desired amount of PT-19 trainers increased tenfold. It was estimated that to handle the desired workload now required by the military, the factory would need to see a 3,500% increase from just prior to Pearl Harbor. This meant not only seriously increased factory space, but also a tremendous amount of added workers, all of which needed training, and all of which meant time. The beginning of World War II was an awakening for much of the population of Hagerstown. For many, it meant a switch from an agrarian life to one more urban. For men of military age, enlistment to fight overseas was seemingly inevitable, and for others, life as factory workers appeared every bit as likely. For those wanting to do their bit for the old USA, Hagerstown offered only a few choices. Being predominantly a farming community, the obvious choice for many was to help bolster the nation's food supply by working on the farm. Although a task highly noble and one desperately needed during times of war, it offered few accolades, and for most came second when compared to building weapons for national defense. With the outbreak of war in late 1941, Fairchild and the PT-19 were suddenly hurled into national and international prominence, and if not only by association, Hagerstown as well. Although a city of considerable industrial capability, it had remained throughout the 1930s a rather sleepy one of only 32,000 people. Several highly successful businesses, which made up the bulk of the economy, were homegrown and took pride in their association with the community. Among its most famous were the M.P. Moeller Pipe Organ Company, Brandt Cabinet Works, Hagerstown Leather Company, Staten Furniture Manufacturing Company, and Pangborn. As well, Hagerstown had a vibrant railroad life and served as a major hub for the Western Maryland, Baltimore and Ohio, and Pennsylvania railroads. The airport had continued to grow under the direction of Dick Henson throughout the 1930s and early 40s. At the beginning of World War II, the Henson flying service found itself uniquely suited through its pilot training to aid in national defense. Henson was awarded one of initially a very few contracts to house and train pilots. Dubbed Henson Ensigns, these cadets stayed in a specially constructed barracks built near the brick terminal.
At the beginning of the war, Fairchild found itself facing a dilemma. To expand the factory to the size required would take time in excess of that which the military allowed. Equally, Fairchild primary training planes were those first needed to begin to teach potential pilots to fly. The company's only option, if it wished to supply aircraft to the military on a timely manner, was to devise a host of subcontractors who would manufacture parts, components, and sections of aircraft apart from the main plant. The Hagerstown system, as it became known, employed businesses throughout the city to manufacture parts and components which were in many ways related to the type of skills each had. The M.P. Moeller Pipe Organ Company, which was officially the largest pipe organ manufacturer in the country, had by nature of their business skilled woodworkers. In February 1942, the U.S. government officially asked Moeller to halt production on organs and immediately convert to the production of wooden wings and center sections for the Fairchild PT-19. Within 1 year, Moeller had produced, with an average of 1,200 workers, 3,400 wooden wings and over 2,000 center sections. By war's end, wings and center sections for over 5,000 aircraft had been completed.
Hagerstown's furniture manufacturers also found themselves employed in the task of producing parts for war. The Brandt Cabinet Works, Beachley Furniture Company, and Staten Furniture Manufacturing Company had before the war been major producers of both reproduction wood furniture and upholstered chairs. Each were asked to cease production of these non-vital goods and convert to the production of wooden parts and sections for the Fairchild PT-19. Staten and Beachley, which had experience in upholstering chairs, also aided in the placement of the cloth covering over certain parts, while Brandt concentrated both on wooden fabrication as well as the welding of aluminum sections for both Fairchild and fellow Maryland aircraft manufacturer Glenn L. Martin. Brandt was also contracted by the U.S. Navy directly to produce Grumman Wildcat fighter aircraft mock-ups. These were to be used for training purposes and specifically for naval carrier deck crews. Involved in the creation of Fairchild airplanes was nearly every machine shop throughout Hagerstown. Each were assigned specific parts to be fabricated, with each needing boring, drilling, tapping, or splining. Such businesses as Foltz Manufacturing and Supply Company, Kaufman Manufacturing and Supply Company, Maryland Machine and Foundry Works, and the Mitchell Corporation each were assigned specific parts to be made for Fairchild. By far the largest participant in the Hagerstown system was Fairchild itself. Apart from manufacturing primary training planes for the Army and Navy, Fairchild also produced the AT-21 Advanced Gunnery Trainer and the C-61 Utility Cargo Airplane. From 1941 to 44, Fairchild produced approximately 1,200 PT-19 trainers each year. The AT-21, although developed in Hagerstown and the first few constructed here, was manufactured at the Fairchild plant in Burlington, North Carolina. This aircraft was built with parts manufactured under the Hagerstown system and shipped south for final assembly. In total, 166 of these aircraft were completed and used by the Army Air Force. Employment at Fairchild was 200 workers in 1939, and within 3 years it had risen to 3,500, and by 1943, no less than 8,000 employees worked in 25 different plants throughout the city. Fairchild itself served as a subcontractor for the Glenn L. Martin Company of Baltimore. The manufacture of the wings for the all-metal PBM-3C seaplane and the Model 187 were fabricated by Fairchild employees in the same building that housed the world's largest poultry show, located at the Hagerstown Fairgrounds. Some components for the wings were sent to Hagerstown from the Martin factory, but still others were manufactured under the direction of the Hagerstown system. The airport also served as port of entry and exit of Hagerstown system-built aircraft. It was abuzz with airplanes taxiing, taking off and landing. The ferrying of PT-19s and C-61s kept the landing strip and the community surrounding it roaring with sound. WAFs and WASPs of the Women's Auxiliary Flying Service and Women's Army Service Pilots organizations transported the finished airplanes to the necessary ports or military training bases. Dignitaries such as movie stars and high-ranking military personnel frequently flew into Hagerstown during the war, either to check out production or just en route to another destination, or simply to keep the morale up toward winning the war for Uncle Sam. At its height, the Hagerstown system involved 15 separate independent industries scattered throughout the entire city. Each industry had its own individual subcontracted parts, components, or sections of the aircraft for which they were responsible for casting, machining, or assembling. An entire fleet of trucks, most driven by women, were employed to move one part or section onto the next location. Some parts would be shipped to other plants or to other subcontractors. Still others would be transported back to the main plant for final assembly. All transportation from one location to the next was managed and arranged by Fairchild. Essentially, the company viewed Hagerstown as one gigantic factory rather than individual buildings dispersed in many cases miles from one another.
The employment of Hagerstown's businesses in the production of PT-19 parts and components is only a fraction of the Hagerstown system. The need for increased factory space forced Fairchild to lease available buildings throughout the city. An entire network of factories were leased, and vacant buildings and unneeded storage facilities converted into factory floors. 25 different locations were utilized for the purpose of aircraft production during the first full year of the war. In total, 1 million square feet of space was used throughout Hagerstown, with the primary goal of producing more PT-19s.
The Hagerstown system became much more than simply a means to an end. What it did was create an atmosphere of community which never before could have been imagined. The mutual cause to which everyone was working focused on production for war, and more specifically than any other community, production of one particular product for war. The Fairchild PT-19 became the icon of Hagerstown's war effort and came to symbolize the sweat and labor of a single community and its fight for the preservation of land and liberty.
It was at the height of the war in 1943 that Fairchild's production of PT-19s began to start winding down. One thing which had become painstakingly clear in the first 2 years of the war was the lack of and need for airplanes which could carry munitions and supplies. Never before had a war like this one been fought, and never before had the airplane played such a pivotal role as supplier to troops on the front line. The military found it necessary to convert DC-3 aircraft and other airplanes initially designed for commercial passenger purposes to cargo haulers. Needless to say, they were not optimum for the task, but lacking any other, they did the job, albeit inefficiently. In mid-1943, Fairchild was prompted by the Army Air Force to finalize a basic design for a large cargo hauling aircraft. Chief Engineer Armin Theiblot had already begun work on the design of this type, which would utilize a large central fuselage and have twin tail booms, one attached to each wing. Work on the F-78 military freighter began late in 1941 to the Army Air Force's initial criteria. The extremities of the war and Fairchild's then current obligations for production of the PT-19 and several other types made work on the prototype limited. Late in 1942, the Army procured funding for one prototype to be assembled under the restrictions and condition that it be made of non-vital materials. Wood was chosen as the material to be used, but this restriction was removed mid-assembly, although several of the parts were still made under the Fairchild patented Duramold process. The aircraft produced under the basic Theiblot design became a twin-engine, high-wing machine suitable for small tanks and most Army munitions and ordnance. The C-82's first flight took place on the 11th of September, 1944, by Chief Test Pilot Dick Henson. The Army Air Force was in such a great need for this airplane that it did something unheard of. It gave Fairchild an order for 100 even before its first flight. They wanted them as soon as possible. A twin tail boom design allowed for easy access to the cargo bay, which had clamshell doors opening outward, allowing for completely unobstructed loading and unloading. It was also designed for the dropping of cargo or supplies while in flight, and its rear clamshell doors could be removed so that supplies could be slid out of the rear of the cargo bay with the aid of an attached parachute. Beyond its capabilities as a cargo hauler, it also was designed for towing gliders, and in fact could pull two at one time. Used extensively during the Second World War, gliders were not to last, and this feature outside of military testing was never to be used in combat. But one thing which the C-82 became very famous for was its ability as a troop transport. It could carry 42 combat-ready paratroopers, and in times of evacuation, accommodate 34 stretchers. During the last half of 1944, the aircraft was fully tested, and any adjustments or modifications were made to the production models. By August of 1945, C-82s began to roll off the assembly line in quantity production, and the Army's new cargo aircraft went into service immediately.
The Flying Boxcar, built to carry a tremendous cargo of Army vehicles and supplies within its roomy fuselage. Loaded through rear doors, this C-82 transport plane is designed for the swift transfer of vital military freight from production line to battlefront. The C-82 takes off easily, lifting after a brief run. In great new specially designed transports like this one lies one answer to the pressing problem of supply.
The aircraft was initially accepted with great enthusiasm, and plans were made by the military to begin a second line of production under North American Aviation at their Dallas, Texas facility. North American was given an order for 792 C-82s, and the production line was begun. However, only 3 airplanes had been completed by the time the contract was canceled with the surrender of Japan in late 1945. Fairchild's contract for the C-82 was scaled down, and they eventually produced 220 of the Flying Boxcars, with the last being delivered in September of 1948. With all the success Fairchild had with the C-82, they had throughout its production also been working on building a replacement for the PT-19. As designer and creator of the PT-19, Theiblot was the obvious person, and Fairchild the obvious company for the military to look to for the next generation of primary trainers. With no intention of losing this distinction, Theiblot began a basic design in early 1945. This airplane had an all-metal skin and was a low-wing monoplane. Late that same year, Fairchild was given the green light by the military to develop 3 examples of the Model 92 primary trainer. Throughout the immediate post-war years, Fairchild and the military put the planes through extensive testing. But production of the Model 92, which became better known by its Navy designation, the XNQ-1, was never to be. Both political funding and military indecisiveness impaired and paralyzed the project. It was never produced. Fairchild's effect on everyday life in Hagerstown mirrored the success of the PT-19 and C-82. As Fairchild grew, so did the community, bringing in fresh faces and diversification from afar. The airport also benefited tremendously as the home of Fairchild aircraft. The Henson flying service dealt with daily operations, offered service and repair, and airplane fuel. More and more airplanes en route to other destinations began stopping at Hagerstown, and life in and around the airport was vibrant. In late 1947, the C-82 was nearing the end of its production run, and Fairchild began designing its successor. Although the design of the C-82 proved successful, Fairchild had rushed its design along due to the urgent need and time restraints of war. The airplane that now took shape in the fall of 1948 had the same general appearance, but had several important changes, making it much more user-friendly. On the C-82, the cockpit had been placed above the cargo area, which made visibility for the pilot very difficult. But on the newly designed C-119A, the cockpit was moved down and forward, eliminating the large bulbous nose of its predecessor. The new airplane was also fitted with 2,650 horsepower engines, which offered 550 horsepower more than the somewhat underpowered C-82. Such enhancement, and especially the increased engine size, allowed for greater cargo hauling capability and decreased the length of runway required for takeoff. Production of the C-119 began in early 1949, and deliveries in December of that year. The C-82 and then its successor, the C-119, placed Fairchild and its home of Hagerstown at the center of military aircraft production. The atmosphere of community, which was so pivotal during the Second World War, was still alive and well throughout the late 1940s and 50s. The company, in fact, prided itself on its association with such a small and closely knit community. Fairchild sponsored activities such as baseball, softball, and basketball, as well as bowling leagues, added to a sense of corporate community and promoted comradeship between workers on a social level. Picnics and corporate gatherings were also held, which mingled company executives with line workers. By the early 1950s, the company payroll had reached an impressive 10,000 employees. The C-119, which had been in service for only a year or two, was performing well in the Korean conflict, and Fairchild continued to produce them as quickly as possible. The C-119's affectionate name of the Flying Boxcar became synonymous with Hagerstown, and quickly became known and in use on all corners of the earth. Production at Fairchild, now more than ever, defined life around Hagerstown, and everyone knew at least a handful of people that punched the time clock down at the boxcar plant. To Hagerstown natives, the early 1950s was one of considerable pride. It seemed that the sound of radio engines was one that was always above, and that inevitable glance skyward which followed expectantly revealed the silhouette of the lumbering twin-tailed giant. For many, this sound verged on paternal pride and that motherly sense of accomplishment that accompanies any great achievement born of hard work and sacrifice. Hagerstown was also the birthplace of many other unique aircraft designs during the 1950s. Fairchild experimented with a pack plane, which used the well-known twin-tail design, but had a cargo pod or pack, which could be easily removed. The XC-120 allowed for the easy pickup and delivery of materials and cargo without the need for the airplane to remain idle during the unloading and loading process. The pod could be detached and a new one replaced within a matter of minutes rather than hours for regular airplanes. Another Fairchild airplane which was novel for its design was the C-119H. The plane had a normal C-119 fuselage, but had attached to it extended wings. The design allowed for greater length of flight with increased capacity for fuel. Its one drawback was that it allowed for no greater increase in cargo space. Only one of the airplanes was produced and tested by the military, although no contract for its production resulted. Beyond production and experimentation at Fairchild, several local concerns took up the task of creating their own unique airplane designs. The most notable pioneer in an entirely revolutionary design was Willard Custer. A self-taught engineer and inventor, he had devised a way of creating lift by forcing air through a channel-type wing. His first design and patent was as early as 1928, but the first airplane utilizing this new design was not completed until the late 1930s. The potential that it held intrigued the Army enough in the 1940s that an example was given to them for testing. Although successful in creating lift, Custer began to compare his machine to the helicopter, which the Army had already bet heavily on. But Willard Custer was not a man to give up without a fight. He continued to revise and enhance his design throughout the 1940s and 50s. He was resolute in the correctness of his overall design, and rode a roller coaster of successes and failures up into the 1960s. There were times when it seemed like production was only moments away, and others where everything, including a skeptical industry, was bearing down on him, doubting the viability of what he had created. But throughout, Custer continued to promote his design, but without being wholly successful in his bid to change the very founding principles of flight. The Custer design also spurred on another Hagerstown-based company to create an airplane with a licensed channel wing. The Funkel Aircraft Corporation was formed in 1959 with the intention of creating a two-passenger private owner airplane. It was foreseen that this airplane would take on much of the same responsibilities as a car. Low estimated landing speeds, made possible by the Custer channel design, would allow for the use of very limited landing strips that could be built almost anywhere. The president of Hagerstown-based Victor Products Corporation, Justin Funkhauser, and local photographer Frank Kelly served as both the company's inspiration as well as chairman and president. The design, beyond simply conception, was finalized and built by the creator of the Taylor Cub, which became the Piper Cub. C.G. Taylor designed the prototype throughout 1960 to 62, but it seemed that money was always tight for the company. The prototype was completed, so the taxi test commenced, but the airplane never went into production. Another design, which had much the same goal as Funkel, in providing an aircraft which could be used by the masses, was a product of the Umball Aircraft Corporation. Raymond Umball, a World War II pilot and owner of the Umball Agricultural Chemical Company, designed the A-10 autogyro to be used by his traveling salesmen. This company had originated in Ocala, Florida, but seeking manufacturing facilities in the late 1950s, had contracted with Fairchild to build the machine in Hagerstown. Flight testing around the airport led to several tail design changes in an attempt to make the gyro more stable. A little over a year after moving to Hagerstown, Umball was on the move again. With only a handful of machines produced, the company was faced with the difficulty of convincing potential customers of the safety and practicality of the Umball A-10. The Chase Aircraft Company of Trenton, New Jersey had designed a cargo aircraft which could be fitted with either 4 jet engines or 2 radio engines. It had a conventional fuselage and large rear door. Chase, however, which had only produced gliders, was a small concern owned by Henry Kaiser. The U.S. military was impressed by the design of the plane, but it did not have faith that the small organization had the capability to produce the machine in quantity. With Fairchild looking for a new design, and with them having experience in the manufacture of cargo aircraft, the contract to build the Chase C-123 was given to Fairchild in June of 1953. The first production C-123 rolled out of the factory in Hagerstown in July 1954, and in total 303 aircraft were produced by the end of the contract in 1958.
The name Dick Henson, of course, to all us aviation lovers, is certainly not a new one.
Well,
I know you've been with this outfit a few weeks anyway.
Yes, I have. That's quite nice of you to say that. I've been here almost 25 years.
I know you have. Flown everything they've championed, I guess.
Yeah, from the old PT-19s on up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite an airplane, the old 19.
They tell me when you get up here to show some of the military off, you really get their tonsils sunburned, turning them inside out.
Well, we try to do them a job. It's the airplane that does it, but we carry along.
Basically, each plane that comes out, I guess, do you personally take it up, or do you have a crew?
We have a crew of about 10 pilots, but I do most of the prototype work, along with my assistant, Dutch
You go up making suggestions for alterations.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. This aircraft is terrific in assault, but we put J-44 jets on it a short while ago, and it's about 13,000-pound overload you can feather on takeoff, and it's outstanding.
I would think that regardless of the service, this thing is made for ground service or field or flying troops.
That's correct. That's correct. For rough terrain, it doesn't matter.
What kind of poundage can you put in there if it's not a military secret?
Well, up to 16,000 is normal.
Is it?
That's normal.
How long can you fly then on that amount of weight?
We have a fuel range of over 2,000 miles.
Is that so?
That would cut down some on your payload.
Yeah. Dick, my eyes have been opened in a very short while here at the famous Fairchild place. I'm delighted to have had the chance to meet you because I'm kind of air-minded.
Well, that's nice of you, Mark. We sure enjoy having you come up.
Thanks very much.
Come back to see us soon again.
You. Boy. Oh, it purrs like a kitten.
Fairchild also began dabbling in the creation of missiles and drones in the mid to late 50s. The Goose and USD-5 were fully tested by the Air Force and Army, but did not go into production. The company began to rely, either by monetary restraints or developmental time restrictions, on joining with foreign companies to market and/or produce their aircraft in the United States. Several contracts were made to this end, with the most notable being that with Fokker Aircraft of Holland, and later Pilatus of Switzerland. In 1954, Fairchild agreed to build the Fokker F-27 jet turboprop airplane in the United States. This airplane was the first jet-powered commercial airplane in the world, and was a revolutionary design in many ways. Fairchild did aid in the final design, and can be given some credit in that regard. The initial Fairchild F-27 was identical to its European counterpart, and slightly over 200 of them were made from 1957 to 1963. Sales of this aircraft were made both to corporations for private use as well as airlines, and it is to the airlines that the airplane garnered its greatest reputation. Many were still using the venerable Douglas DC-3 airplane, and the F-27 offered a comparable seating number, but with greater fuel efficiency and speed. The model FH-227 was developed and added another 1/3 as many possible occupants to the F-27, without requiring a massive redesigning of the aircraft as a whole. This design proved desirable, but still was not the success the company had hoped it would be. The production of the Pilatus Porter in the early 1960s was part of a time of considerable change at Fairchild, witnessing the attempt by the company to secure several different angles in a quickly changing field of aviation companies. The acquisition of Hiller Helicopter Company in 1963 and the takeover of Republic Aviation in 1965 were both achieved in the hope of securing a place for Fairchild in a world where there were fewer and fewer government contracts to be had. The military was driving most of the downsizing and repositioning in the industry by wanting new aircraft that could be easily modified and updated. No longer would military planes serve for 5 to 10 years and then be mothballed, but rather they would serve, be modified, and then serve again and again. Fewer contracts resulted in the crowding of existing aviation companies attempting to secure them. The acquisition of Republic Aviation bought for Fairchild entry into the elite club of fighter aircraft design. The famous Republic P-47 of World War II fame, F-84 and then current F-105 fighter, further widened the swath of potential government contracts. With this experience, Fairchild-Republic began to design an airplane to be entered in the Air Force competition for the next close air attack aircraft. Designated the A-10, this airplane competed against the Northrop A-9. The competition was tough, and the project for the A-10 seemed at some times winning and at others falling behind. In January 1973, after nearly 7 months of tests and fly-offs between the Northrop and Fairchild, the Air Force officially chose the Fairchild-Republic A-10 as the winner. 5 more aircraft were ordered for evaluation, and finally, the Air Force fully committed in February of 1974 with an order for 52. With parts and pieces being constructed at the Republic plant on Long Island, final assembly and flight testing took place in Hagerstown. The first production A-10 rolled off the assembly line in March of 1976 and continued for the next 8 years, with 713 being completed. On March 20th, 1984, the very last A-10A Thunderbolt II, affectionately nicknamed the Warthog, rolled out of the hangar at Hagerstown for its official handover to the Air Force. The Fairchild factory at Hagerstown, after nearly 60 years of production, was closed. It was in 1962 that Dick Henson began to see the need for passenger service out of Hagerstown to Baltimore and Washington. Although Allegheny Airlines owned the routes in and out of Hagerstown, the large airplanes which they flew were not economical. Dick purchased several smaller airplanes, including a Beech 18, and the Hagerstown Commuter was born. The inaugural flight was on April 23, 1962, from Hagerstown to Washington, D.C. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, the Hagerstown Commuter, which became the Allegheny Commuter and then the Piedmont Regional Airline, continued to grow. By the mid-1980s, the Henson Piedmont Regional Airline was the third largest commuter airline in the country and flew in and out of nearly every major city on the East Coast, from Maine to the Bahamas. The airport is now the home of many businesses, including those that manufacture aircraft components, do service and repair, as well as create and offer many other aviation-related services. Equally, many owners of private airplanes, as well as corporations, house their aircraft on the very field now named Richard A. Henson Field, a field that has played and will continue to play a vital role in the growth and vibrancy of our community, the community of Hagerstown.
Hagerstown has truly been blessed by its aviation past. It was a few pioneering men that inspired our community's nearly 70-year history of aviation manufacturing, a history that in its wake offered Hagerstown an unparalleled opportunity for greatness. But it was the people of the community of Hagerstown that truly made something great. May we never forget the remarkable and continuing story
of Hagerstown's aviation heritage.